Bright lights.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're going to be talking about psychedelics tonight. I will introduce myself. My name is Shayla Love. I'm a science and health journalist. When I first started paying attention to psychedelic research, it was around the year 2017, and I was working at Vice at the time. And if you're not familiar with Vice Media, this is a place where psychedelics were always in the mainstream. And so because of that, I really had the privilege of not asking, will psychedelics go mainstream in my reporting, but how will they go mainstream? And thinking about how they would integrate into pre-existing systems like health insurance, FDA approval, the patent system, churches. And so I'm really excited to talk about this today because it's a question I've been thinking about for a very long time. Not just will psychedelics go mainstream, but as I've done reporting over the last 7-8 years, should they go mainstream? Should they fit into these existing systems? Or are there ways in which psychedelics can reveal the flaws in these systems and actually work from the inside out to change them? So I have a really lovely panel to talk about these topics. I'm going to have you each introduce yourselves and what brings you here today.
Hi, I'm Rick Doblin, and I was 18 years old when I decided to focus my life on psychedelics back in 1972. I have super great parents. I was in the beginning of my freshman year of college, and I said, I'm dropping out of college. I'm the oldest of 4 kids. I'm dropping out of college. I want to study LSD, and I want you guys to pay for it. And after a couple of months, they said yes. So it's been a long journey, but in '86, 38 years ago, I started the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies as a nonprofit psychedelic pharmaceutical company. We're one of the slowest startups in history, but we're getting close. And I've gone to the Kennedy School. I wanted to be a therapist for individuals, and when I wanted to get the clinical psych PhD, nobody would let me in because I wanted to study psychedelics, and there was no way to do research. So I realized I had to study the politics because the politics was blocking the science. So I feel like I do psychotherapy for culture. And that's been successful in a sense that we do have a renaissance in psychedelic research. And why I'm here today is just to share these stories of where we're at and where we're going.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Brendel. I'm a past president of the American Psychiatric Association. I practice psychiatry in Boston. I'm an associate professor of psychiatry, global health, and social medicine at Harvard Medical School, where I direct our Center for Bioethics. So I think a lot both about treatment, about the integrity of the profession, about the responsibility of medical professions, and also about the ethics of the work that we do. Really pleased to be here.
Hi, thank you all for coming. My name is Ernesto Londoño. I'm a journalist at the New York Times. My interest in psychedelics began in 2018 when I went on an ayahuasca retreat in Brazil, where I was living and working at the time. So I stumbled into this during a midlife crisis, which I realized makes me really unique in this space. And the experience was really transformative. I was very depressed before going on this retreat, and when I left, I was no longer depressed. But I had a lot of questions about whether what I experienced was replicable, but also a lot of questions about the characters and the places that were creating this field, this emerging field. And it's a bit of a wild west. So what began as a personal journey soon turned into a journalistic exploration. I got permission to spend 2022 on the road, going to a bunch of psychedelic retreats to work on a book called Trippy, The Peril and Promise of Medicinal Psychedelics. And my book starts at a church in Austin run by a woman who's a former crack addict and stripper who was treating suicidal veterans. And then the last chapter takes place at a clinic run by the VA. That was it was the first site that got permission from the government to administer MDMA as a medicine to veterans with PTSD. So I cover a lot of ground, and I think the more I explore this world, the more questions I'm left with.
Thank you. And so, as we've heard, there's a lot of different areas that psychedelics can touch, but I think since we're at a health conference and a lot of people may be here because of their interest in the mental health applications, we should start with some of the medical stuff. And there was news in the past couple of weeks, you may have seen that there was a meeting where an advisory group connected to the FDA was evaluating MDMA for PTSD. And so MDMA is up for approval for PTSD right now, and there was a vote, and I thought maybe Rebecca could talk to us about the vote. We would have Rick say it, but he's in the middle of sensitive discussions with the FDA, and it's a bit limited on what he can talk about. But maybe, Rebecca, you can walk us through what exactly happened at that meeting.
All right. Well, I'm going to do my best, and Rick has promised to give me a private report card on August 12th after the FDA decision on how I do on this. So, the studies that came before the advisory committee, there were 2 studies with almost 200 patients. And the first thing that's really important to know about this is that when you look at the results of these studies, they show very significant differences in symptom reduction for the participants who were treated with MDMA as opposed to those who were not, right? So then why are we having this conversation if the treatment effect size looked so big? So the FDA advisory committee looked at 2 things. One was efficacy, and the other was risk-benefit profile and safety, right? So. And they voted no on both. So why did that happen? So, without going too much into the details, we could talk about that the entire evening and then some more. But 2 groups of issues that they brought up. The first, which was a 9-2 vote against, on efficacy really brought up questions about blinding. I know we're going to talk more about that, but because the effects of MDMA are immediate and people can tell when they get it, it's really hard. It's hard to have a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, even if you give someone a placebo. So just to give you a sense of what that means, that when in the survey data after the trial, 90% of the people who got MDMA knew they had gotten MDMA. Shocking. Okay. And then 75% of the people who were in the placebo arm knew that they were in the placebo arm. Okay, so that was one of the things. So it really sort of deviated from this idea that it was blinded, and a lot of questions that came from AdCom about expectancy bias, right? So if you knew that you were in the active treatment arm, did that lead you to have an exaggerated effect size? Okay, so there were some other questions also about the role of psychological support, about the therapy, and how much of the effect size could be attributed to the MDMA as opposed to the psychotherapy, and that's sort of the gist of what led up to this decision in the report. The second set of questions were really around safety profile, and so this was a 10-1 vote against, and here were the kinds of things that AdCom was concerned about. And maybe we'll come back next year and Rick can tell us some more about this, because I know he has so much to say. I'm channeling him. That's why I'm sitting next to him. Okay. So really, here's what some of the concerns were. So people who got MDMA got elevations in their blood pressure, they had elevations in their heart rate, and we know in studies of illicit use that cardiac side effects can be an issue. Secondarily, concerns about damage to the liver. There were some about how much should we have been monitoring the heart rhythm as well in the study. One thing I want to highlight before I stop talking about so much about this one particular hearing is one of the interesting things that the committee said about this, which was, you told us about the negative things that happened, but you didn't put any quotations in, and you didn't really give us data about positive effects that participants felt from ingesting MDMA. And so what they worried about were things like euphoria, right? What is the abuse potential? Where could this go? And why wasn't that included? So I think that gives you a pretty balanced sense of what the major nuts and bolts were of the outcome of that hearing.
Thank you. That's a really, really great summary. And I want to return to the blinding issue because I've thought a lot and written a lot about clinical trial design in psychedelics. I want to commend the MDMA studies for even asking about blinding. Like, do you know what group you were in? Because even that can be something that's skipped over. The FDA requires a randomized clinical trial, but they don't actually require you to assess blinding for approval. And there was a study done in 2021 on ketamine-assisted therapy, or just ketamine therapy for treatment-resistant depression, and none of them even looked at blinding. And so these are questions that we really need to assess, but this is a way it sort of clashes with mainstreaming if you can't get approval because you're asking about blinding, and then it reveals that there's blinding issues because, of course, there are. The subjective effects are so strong. So I think this is an area in which, Rick, if you're able to talk very generally, not about MDMA, but about clinical trial design and blinding, these issues also affect other psychiatric drugs. What do you think about the double blind and its role?
Well, I can say that Dr. Tom Loughran, who used to be the head of psychiatry products, said that one would think then when you're studying like SSRIs, where you don't have such a strong, subjective effect, it takes weeks for it to have an effect, that might be a way that you can do a blind study. And what he said is that even with SSRIs, they're not really that well blinded because the people report certain kind of side effects, and people can tell from the side effect profile which group people are in. So it's very difficult to do a real effective double-blind study in psychiatry, even with drugs that don't have such a strong effect as MDMA or psilocybin or ketamine.
Mm-hmm. And people can try to use active placebos. In the famous Good Friday experiment, they gave some people psilocybin and some people niacin, which is B vitamin, and it was very clear based on who saw God and who didn't, who got the niacin. But people have been trying. There was a great study recently. They didn't assess how effective this was. They made a fake ayahuasca by mixing potato flour and cacao flour and making just a disgusting brown sludge, and that didn't really trick people either. So it's really complicated, and some of the more innovative trial designs the FDA will not accept as trials that they will approve a drug by. So it's really a struggle. As this is all happening, there's a big resurgence, I think, of psychedelic retreats, psychedelics in the underground. This has been going on for a long time, but them being above ground and being up for FDA approval is certainly influencing what the underground thinks. What have you seen, Ernesto, in terms of how the FDA process is influencing that side of the psychedelic community?
Sure. I mean, I think among people who are facilitating these experiences, either at retreats abroad or underground here, or increasingly above ground with psychedelic churches, which are operating really openly, people are really interested in the regulatory conversation and what's happening, politically, but they're not waiting for an FDA stamp of approval to convince them that this is a good idea, that this is therapeutic, and that this is something they want to be doing it. I think they're interested insofar as rescheduling and legalization would reduce the risk of the work they're doing, but I don't think these people are terribly concerned about the efficacy and kind of the nitty-gritty of what scientists are really debating right now in the context of this process. And I think, in fact, many of the people who have carved out roles for themselves in psychedelic-assisted therapy or in spiritual settings don't present themselves as an extension of the mental health care system, but as an alternative to the mental health care system, and a mental health care system that is often spoken about derisively in these circles. There's a lot of anti-medical dogma that you hear in psychedelic circles. There's a lot of people who have very, unflattering things to say, for instance, about SSRIs or psychiatric medications. There's a deeply ingrained narrative that the pharmaceutical industry and the mainstream mental health care system profits off of people who are chronically ill. So, I think, and I'm not endorsing those views, I'm just conveying them. But, I think the cat is out of the bag. I think so many people are interested in these therapies, and so many people are suffering with substance use disorders and very serious mental health care challenges that, they're not going to wait around until the law and the regulations change and until there's sort of a clinical lane that is wide open. They're going to continue gravitating toward these unregulated spaces. And in doing so, I think the risk is higher. Things go wrong in the underground, and oftentimes it's really hard to hold people accountable when things go awry.
That's so interesting because there was a response to the FDA AdCom meeting by someone in the psychedelic, more like traditional biotech pharmaceutical space, Christian Angerme, and he is well known for having comments about things. And he said basically, this is why you should leave drug approval to biotech, like to the pharmaceutical guys. We know what we're doing, we know how to get things approved, and this is why you shouldn't do it another way. Again, this is what he said. I'm not endorsing that view at all.
I should just add that he also said, oh, and I have a drug like MDMA that I'm going to make into a medicine.
Yes, and it's patented.
And he's got a patented version.
Yeah, but
This a drug that's not as good, I should add.
I feel as a practicing psychiatrist, I think it's really, really important that we're talking about the promise and the hope of psychedelics and new therapeutics that can benefit people who are living with mental illness. So there's no question about that. I think it's also really important as we're talking about this and we think about what the risks are when we're underground and when we're doing things that don't have are not yet FDA approved, that we think about what that means. So we could talk about whether our regulatory framework should be different, whether our pathways should be different. Those are all kinds of conversations that are open as we start thinking about whole new classes of therapeutics and interventions, right? But it's really important to know that the medications that are FDA approved do have a favorable risk-benefit ratio, and they are effective, right? So really important to know that people are struggling with active symptoms of a mental health condition, that there are ways of getting help, and that mental health care does work, right? So if you want to look for resources, mentalhealthcareworks.org is our APA Foundation website, or if you're experiencing symptoms, really important to know that you, at any time, English, Spanish, texting, phone, you can always refer someone to 988 to talk to a trained crisis counselor in the moment. And I just want everyone to know as we talk about all these new possibilities and the great hope that we'll get better at treating mental illness, that people know that there also are approved therapies that are available right now.
Yeah, I guess I'll just add a point that a lot of the approved therapies, the fundamental difference between them and psychedelics is that these are medications meant to be taken on a daily basis for a very long time. And if you stop taking them, sometimes the problems come back. They're more symptom control than curative. Whereas the goal with psychedelic-assisted therapies is to get to the root cause after only a few administrations, surrounded by preparation and integration. So it's really not just about the psychedelic experience itself, and this is where the therapists and the psychiatrists really make a big difference. It's about how you prepare people for the experience, and then after they've had the experience, how do you help them integrate it into their life? Because the goal is to make it so that people don't need to keep doing these psychedelic treatments very often.
Well, and that is a difficulty in bringing psychedelics to market, is that it's paired with psychotherapy. It's paired with these preparation integration sessions. And the FDA hasn't regulated therapy before, especially in combination with a drug as a single package. I wonder if there's anything either of you can say about that, is there any precedent there, or exactly how would they go about doing that? There's something called a REMS, which is sort of instructions that comes paired with a drug after it's approved. There could be some stuff there, but what do you think about this sort of no man's land of having to say exactly how a therapeutic process works alongside a drug?
Well, look, we don't really have a precedent for it. We do have manualized psychotherapies that have been validated in large studies, right? So in the area of post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, both cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure do have good data supporting their efficacy. But that's very different than something that's individualized. And there's no question that as you look at the progression of the past 4 or so decades, more than that, or 5, that there's been less of an emphasis in psychiatric training on psychotherapy than there previously had been. So I'm looking around the room at wonderful people who I've spoken to over the past few days who share this view that we need to all be thinking about not just medications, but when we're talking about things that are so important to our experience and our lives as humans, notwithstanding symptoms or experiences, that we're also thinking about how we treat the whole person and how we bring together both safe and effective medications and compounds, and also how we engage in the human and the psychotherapeutic process.
Yeah, the VA just did a really interesting study, published it just a couple years ago. It was about 914 veterans, and they compared prolonged exposure with cognitive processing therapy. And what they showed is that about half the people dropped out of the therapy, that the therapies themselves were re-traumatizing, because you have to confront your trauma. So it's very difficult to do for people who have been burdened by, major traumas in their past. And so that's where sometimes it comes in, where you take a drug, a psychedelic drug or other drugs, to make the therapy more effective. So there are projects underway now to blend MDMA with cognitive processing therapy and also with prolonged exposure. So I think the main thing to say here is that the psychedelics are just tools. And whether it's beneficial or not depends on how they're used. And they're tools that can be used in many different therapeutic contexts and therapeutic modalities as well.
From traveling to a bunch of different retreats over the course of a year, and we're talking about sort of trying to find some consistency or regulation of therapy in the approved medical model, is there any consistency in what people do while they're guiding others on psychedelics across retreats, or is it really just every retreat has its own way?
No, there's a tremendous amount of variance. I think there's some that try to be more clinical, meaning they employ people who are licensed psychotherapists or have training in therapy and medicine. But that tends to be the exception. I think most of this is unfolding in spiritual or quasi-spiritual circles and settings, which makes it very interesting because it's kind of this really uneasy blending of medicine and spirituality. And I find that in the scientific community here, as we're trying to sort of test the promise and the limitations of these compounds, there's this really interesting debate about whether the so-called mystical experiences or spiritual awakenings that many people experience as a result of psychedelic journeys is a bug or a feature of how they become healing. And I think that adds a layer of complexity when it comes to how to understand this through a scientific lens and how to understand this from a regulatory standpoint. We regulate medicine in ways that are consistent and predictable, but how do we regulate something that for many people is first and foremost a spiritual experience?
Yeah, and that's such a good point to raise. And you talked about churches before, and I want to return to that. A few years ago, Michael Pollan told me that with all of the hype around psychedelics, he felt that the way a lot of people were going to end up accessing them was going to be through an increase in churches, so through religious exemption, because that's easier than getting something medically approved or passing a law, is starting a church. And you've done some work. You wrote a piece recently about psychedelic churches. Maybe you can talk about the new psychedelic churches that are emerging and how they're different from some of the older ones that have been around for a long time before this current psychedelic renaissance.
Yeah, there's a really fascinating and somewhat counterintuitive history when it comes to the intersection of drug policy and religious freedom laws and rights in this country. But to make a long story short, there's been a small number of religious communities that have managed to get carve-outs within the Controlled Substances Act, which is kind of the backbone of drug prohibition. The first one was the Native American Church, which in, I think it was 1981, got an exemption from the Department of Justice that essentially said, we understand you've been using this ritualistically, and this is a very important part of your spirituality, so we're not going to apply the law to you. You can continue using peyote, and we understand and respect that. A few years later, the DA raided 2 small ayahuasca churches that have their lineage rooted in Brazilian communities. One was in New Mexico, one was in Oregon. And this led to a years-long battle that resulted with a defeat for the Department of Justice before the Supreme Court, which essentially said, we are persuaded that for your communities, your use of these compounds is sincere religious practice. And the government should have a very high bar when it comes to intervening and meddling in what is and is not religious and sincere practice. However, those communities were very small. As a foundational rule, they don't proselytize. It's really actually hard to get invited to their rituals. They're not easy to find. They're not in the phone book. So these communities remain sort of small until the recent interest that I think was largely fueled by Michael Pollan's book, when there was an explosion of people interested in these therapies. And what we ended up seeing happening was a lot of people who had been dabbling in psychedelic therapy in the underground studied the case law, saw an opening in the case law, and sort of rebranded their once underground operations as churches. And there's a broad spectrum of these churches. Some, I think, are sincere in seeing this as something that is, truly a spiritual practice and a ritual that they, take very seriously. Some are really, making a lot of money getting people in for weekend retreats and charging thousands of dollars and still calling themselves, the church of, who knows what. And, I think what I've seen that's really interesting and distinct about this new iteration of churches is they advertise using the language of mental health. So, they very actively and very publicly say, if you're struggling with PTSD, with addiction, come to us, we can give you a new lease on life. You'll walk away after 72 hours feeling reborn, renewed, reset. And they make really grandiose promises that I worry set up a lot of people for unrealistic expectations.
Yeah, I saw that. I was reporting at a retreat in 2019, and from like 1 second they were showing me neuroimaging results from an Imperial College of London study, and then the next they were burning Palo Santo and smudging us with an eagle wing. And it's very confusing to have these mix of two things together. In the past several years, there's been several channels of psychedelics coming to the mainstream. One is spiritual, one is medical, and then there's also a very broad decriminalization and legal policy access. And I'm curious for all of you how you see these paths remaining parallel or intersecting, or if they ever clash. I know that the legal world and the medical world can sometimes be at odds, and maybe Rick, you can start, because MAPS is an organization that has really been involved in all of those things, and I don't know if there's infighting about that. It seems but maybe you can talk about these different access points and how they're all sort of emerging at the same time.
Yeah, okay, so I think for an example, let's look at medical marijuana. So it turns out that when you ask people if they are going to vote for the legalization of marijuana and what are their reasons, you might think that the most important reason is if they smoke marijuana themselves. But it turns out it's if they know a medical marijuana patient. So people have been miseducated, they don't know what to believe, there's so much propaganda about drugs, but when they know somebody and trust somebody and they hear from them that something they used made them better, then they question everything that they've been told. So the medicalization of marijuana began in 1996 with California and Arizona. And then if you chart the American voters' attitudes towards legalization of marijuana, it's almost in parallel with the growth in medical marijuana states. So I think medicalization is the route that changes people's attitudes. Also, we live in a culture where medicine gets a lot of media, that it's earned media that you don't have to pay for. Nobody had to pay for your book, or I mean, they should pay for your book, I'm sorry. but you get this incredible multiplying effect. So I think medicalization of psychedelics is what's been changing people's attitudes about it. They look at the data, they look at the research, and then you get the drug policy reform efforts that began actually in Denver. Denver was the first city to make mushrooms the lowest enforcement priority. And then that went to a bunch of different cities. And then you have the Oregon Psilocybin Initiative, and then it came back to Colorado for the Natural Plant Initiative, which passed. And so now Colorado is really on the cutting edge of we will see, I think, many more psychedelic churches and all sorts of people offering natural plant medicines. It's on the ballot in Massachusetts in November. The thing that's a little bit hard for me is that when you ask people if they're going to vote for something like this and they hear plants, natural plants, they say yes. But then when you start talking about synthetics, then they're not sympathetic to that. So we've been trying to tell a new narrative that MDMA really does come from a plant. It just happens to be a manufacturing plant.
How's that working out?
And people are getting it. There's actually some MDMA churches now, And there was an effort in Colorado to add, in California, and a legislative effort to add MDMA to a list of natural plant medicines. So I think it is the case that medicalization will be the leading edge into the culture, and then it will change attitudes and it will move towards drug policy reform. And the other thing to say is that the drug war itself, I think, has been largely discredited over the last several decades. And we look at 100,000 plus people a year dying from opiate and fentanyl overdoses. And so the problems are getting worse. And what's going on, the drug war is not really helping. So it's in the past, support for the drug war was what was used to block research into psychedelics and marijuana. The story was, it'll send the wrong message and it'll get in the way of our fear-based messages about drugs. And so now that there's not as much support for the war on drugs, then I think we are seeing more of this rise of the psychedelic churches and the movement towards more and more research without a lot of political opposition to it.
There's also a striking degree of bipartisan support for psychedelics specifically, which makes this really unusual in the broader scope of the war on drugs. And it's largely because veterans have emerged as some of the most visible and effective advocates for expanding research and access to these therapies.
Yeah, I would add, though, that there's 13 million PTSD patients, according to the Veterans Administration, and almost all of the media, not all, but almost all of the media goes to the veterans. But actually, there's many, many more women that have PTSD than men, and certainly than veterans. And so it's through sexual abuse, domestic violence, childhood sexual abuse and neglect, but they don't get as much attention. And also, there's not a single women's group that I've been able to identify that has funded research into trauma related to sexual abuse. There's loads of organizations that support research to help veterans with PTSD, but there's not a single women's group that I'm aware of. If anybody knows it, I'd like to submit an application for a donation. But it's just striking that it's really from the veterans that we've been able to get bipartisan support. And one of the most striking examples of that is that there was an early bill introduced in Congress for federal funding, and it was co-sponsored by AOC and Matt Gaetz.
So let me, it's interesting when you say that medicalization leads to a kind of legitimacy in other parts of society. Yeah. I was actually shocked that doctors still rank third in terms of authority in the polling that was done here on the first day of the conference in some ways, because it seems from where I sit, I'm constantly having patients coming to me with all ideas about new and unproven treatments that they heard anecdotally worked for someone else. And the story of medical marijuana is one in which there's really not a lot of change in what happened in the FDA, and very little medical that happened either in terms of efficacy or and approval. And yet the idea that this was, by calling it medical marijuana, it was a brilliant political move, actually. It had very little to do with actual medical indications or approvals. Now, that's not to say that that medicine is right about all this, right? So whatever the FDA does or doesn't do, right, it may turn out, and many of us believe that there's a lot of hope about what psychedelic compounds may be able to do, especially for the treatment of mental illness. So the question really is, from the standpoint of the responsibility of the medical profession, that when we think about taking N of 1 experiences, or when individuals say, this was really helpful for me, I don't doubt that. Right? But my responsibility as a medical professional is to say, I can then generalize that to large groups of people and population level and be sure both that we're going to have benefit and that the potential risks will not outweigh the potential benefits, that it's safe. And so how we create that space and are transparent about it and have conversations like the one we're having now, looking at all sides in a fair and balanced way, both in terms of promise and in terms of risk, is something we as a society are going to keep doing, right? So from the standpoint of the APA, we are all about the integrity of the scientific integrity of the research and the data and the regulatory process. And so while we believe there's a lot of hope, we think FDA approval is a really, really important step in medical use. On the other hand, research should go on. And we have policy on psychedelics that says it should be determined by the scientific integrity of the data and the studies and not by ballot initiative or popular opinion, right? So the idea that people are open to it is an illicit inference, right, from democracy that this is something that's actually medically valuable or medically indicated. That's not to say that we don't have hope, but it's just to really be clear that in the space that we would traditionally call medical, I'm like the least cool person on the stage, right?
Well, the irony is that the FDA is much more open to psychedelic research than to marijuana research. And so the reason that we have all of these medical marijuana states and marijuana legalization states is that right now, MAPS, the nonprofit, has $12.9 million grant from the state of Michigan to study cannabis in 320 veterans with PTSD. The study has been held up by the FDA for about 2 years, and they are refusing to let us study smoked marijuana, and they're refusing to let us study vaporized marijuana. And their entire critique was about vape pens, which we're not even proposing to use. And so we had a meeting with the FDA before this formal dispute that we're now engaged in with the FDA about our marijuana project, but the people at the FDA said, I hate the word medical marijuana because it's not medical until we say so. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, they're blocking research into marijuana for PTSD. So it's a kind of ironic situation, and hopefully that will change.
And there's no question that the scheduling really led to some of these challenges, right? So one of the reasons we are where we are now in 2024 with compounds that have been around for a really long time is because it made it impossible to do the research, right? So that if we had thought about this differently and thought about how we could do research with good scientific integrity over time, we might be in a very different place right now in terms of our ability to treat those who need our help the most.
Yeah, and to your point about having hope, but I've been really happy to see that there's been more study on adverse events of psychedelics recently, and not just saying here they are, but really characterizing them and what helps people after they have an adverse event on psychedelics. And so I think that'll be really important to not just say this works for everyone or this is something that everyone should do for every condition, but really add to that integrity, the harm reduction aspect to it. On that note, I wanted to, we're going to open up for questions in just a few minutes, but I wanted to ask each of you the question that I started out by saying, should psychedelics be mainstreamed? I think that they will in some sense, that's why we're here, but I have thought a lot about ways in which it would be a shame if psychedelics ended up like mainstream care in terms of sort of neglecting psychotherapy or having things be inaccessible or too costly or brushing adverse events under the rug, which is, I think, a reason why people speak negatively about SSRIs. They had all these negative side effects that no one was really talking about. And so those are the ways in which I think psychedelics should not be like the mainstream and shouldn't go into the mainstream in that way. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that question.
Yeah, well, first let me give a context. What does it mean to mainstream psychedelics? So the origins of Western culture were the Greeks. And from 1600 BC to around 396 AD was the Eleusinian Mysteries. And everybody that we know that was prominent in the Greek world, Plato, Aristotle, Archimedes, all these people participated in the Eleusinian Mysteries, and they involved a psychedelic potion called Kykeon. They were wiped out by the Catholic Church. That was the last time that psychedelics really were mainstreamed in Western culture. We have the burning of the witches, and they were often involved with plant medicines. We have the conquistadors coming to the New World, and the first people they wanted to kill are the shamans who are working with plant medicines because they're the center of their communities. We had a brief kind of explosion of interest during the 60s, and then the backlash, and now we're sort of recovering to that. So when I think about the mainstreaming of psychedelics into Western culture, it's really been a millennium and a half since that was last mainstreamed. And I think it's coming now at a critical time for humanity in that we have, according to E.O. Wilson, he said the problem with humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions with medieval institutions with godlike technologies. So we are not really capable emotional and spiritually to deal with the technologies, hence global warming. So I think the mainstreaming of psychedelics is coming at a critical time for humanity as a whole to do a consciousness shift, to think more collectively, to work more collectively, to not demonize others. Jung said the most important thing that we can do from a political, social, and therapeutic perspective is to withdraw the projection of our shadow onto others and own your own shadow. So I think psychedelics can help with all of that. So I think it's critical that they be mainstream. But I think to take your point, Shayla, that it really is not the drug itself, it's the context and the relationship. And I think if it gets mainstreamed without that, then it's a big loss. And it should be really mainstreamed with this understanding that it's about how we approach them, and more importantly, how do we take the experiences after the psychedelics have left our body and work to integrate it without the psychedelics so that we can achieve some of these same states or similar to those same states on our own without the drugs.
All right, so I have a much simpler answer. Let me just talk about medical mainstreaming. I think for psychedelics to be medically mainstreamed, we need to show both benefit, and we need to show that the benefits of the use of psychedelic outweigh the risks and the potential harms. So we're looking at efficacy and safety. We're on our way to figuring that out, right? We have more and more trials that are coming up. And more interest in those trials. But I think we still have some hurdles until we're really seeing medically, until we're there in a real way. So we'll see where we are next year. We'll see where we are August 12th. But we're definitely moving in that way much further than we were 20 years ago or even 10 years ago.
I mean, I think it has gone mainstream in the sense that the last survey funded by the federal government that asks people about their drug use showed that among adults, there was an all-time high of psychedelic use in the past year. I think it was like 8% for people between the ages of 19 and 35. So that's a lot of people. It's not everybody, but it's a very, significant number of people, and from a very broad, cross-section of demographics. I think one piece that I find really interesting and promising about the mainstreaming of psychedelics is there's renewed interest in understanding and listening to the cosmology of indigenous people, and to having really thought-provoking conversations about how they understand suffering, how they understand spirituality, and how they see the role of these mind-altering substances in enhancing people's lives and in building stronger communities. So if a byproduct of this mainstreaming interest is, an ability for those of us who are not indigenous to listen more carefully with humility and curiosity to what indigenous people have to teach us, I think that would be a great development and a great piece of this. And I hope that is sort of fostered, amplified, and enhanced.
Great. So we can open up for questions now. Thank you to the panel. Right here. There's some microphones coming around.
Can you guys talk a little bit about what you think of how do you or we assess who's ready and who's not to go through a psychedelic experience?
Well, okay, I would say that it's very important that people want to do it, so that when you have family members, let's say that, oh, you should go do this experience because you're suffering this or that, people really need to, in the midst of a psychedelic experience, choose to open up. So that I think when people are ready themselves, more so than when other people sort of say they should do it, that's one of the indicators. The other indicator, I think, is what is their condition? Do they have support? Are they able to come back from a psychedelic experience? Are they coming back into a re-traumatizing situation or not? In some of the early research that MAPS did, there was a certain percentage of people that relapsed, and it tended to be those people that were going back into a re-traumatizing situation. So it's difficult. People have talked about. So I was just in Warsaw Monday and Tuesday, and it was about planning to bring psychedelic-assisted therapies to Ukraine. And what one of the Ukrainians made is that it's not post. There's nothing post about post-traumatic stress. They're living in the middle of stress. And so the question is, should they have therapy or not? and that's a different question, but I think that they should, but I think it's more difficult when you go back into a re-traumatizing situation. So I think there's a lot of choices then if you are ready, then there's a whole which psychedelics do you use? But I would say the next main thing, and this will be the last I'll say, is that it's the trust between the person and the therapist. That's the most important thing, the therapeutic alliance. So if someone doesn't have trust for who they're going to work with, or if they don't necessarily trust a psychedelic church or anything, then they should not go forward.
You know, I'll just say one other small piece of that. When we start thinking about a framework for approval or medical use, and we start thinking about sort of the cornerstone of medical treatment, and we think about informed consent and what we have to talk to people about to make sure people understand what they're electing for treatment. You know, one of the biggest challenges is not just about whether somebody is ready, but how do we create the right circumstances? Because there's so much of an element of even the process of discussing a psychedelic experience or assisted therapy in how that treatment might go. Right? So this is a completely new territory when we start thinking about the way that we practice, certainly within a medical context. When the FDA gets us over the line to try that.
Over there in the corner.
Okay. Thanks. So assuming that the regulatory side is not an issue, on a personal level, what are you most excited about in terms of the psychedelic use for therapy for people? What is it, if you had, like, if the regulatory side was just a non-issue, what person are you most excited about seeing like that become a reality?
Do you want to go first, Rick?
Well, I'll say that one of the things that I'm very excited about is exploring group therapy. So I think that we have issues of the limited number of therapists and psychiatrists. For example, when we want to go to places like Ukraine or to Rwanda or somewhere, there's a lack of therapists and psychiatrists at all. So group therapy with potential identifying local healers, I think that's going to be a really next step to try to understand. The other thing that I'm very interested about is the possibility of doing a project with Ibogaine, which is for substance use disorders, particularly opiates, and for fentanyl. And there's a possibility, there's billions of dollars going from Purdue Pharma and other pharmaceutical companies and distributors paying for the costs of the opiate epidemic. And there was an effort in Kentucky to allocate, they had $840 million, and they were going to allocate $42 million, or we're talking about it, to Ibogaine research with public money. In the end, that did not happen, but other states might do that. So the possibility of working with donor money and public money to take Ibogaine through the system with, we're calling it open Ibogaine, with open science, no patents, and turn it immediately into a generic. So that's something I'm very interested in.
If I could fast forward the tape 20 years and see like how things shape out, the question I'm most interested in is how is this going to change our approach to spirituality? We're in a moment where a lot of people are dropping out of organized religion and have lost faith in their churches and sort of the mainstream religious organizations that have been the bedrock of religious life in America. And at the same time, we're seeing a lot of people gravitate into these, less structured, less dogmatic settings and kind of find their own new relationship with divinity, with God, with the concept of soul, with the really difficult questions that religion has been an intermediary for. So, I do wonder if this is really going to enhance our collective spiritual life. And in doing so, if it's going to bring meaning to people's lives, and if it's going to alleviate the loneliness epidemic by giving us a sense of community.
I think for me, I'm so thrilled to see that psychedelics are forcing us to pay attention to extra pharmacological factors, which exist for all treatments, but it's easier to kind of ignore them or say we're going to do a double-blind trial and the placebo group is effective. As we talked about before, it's almost impossible to do that with psychedelics, and so it forces you to confront expectancy and the context in which a drug is given, and psychotherapy, which I've written about mental health for a long time, and it's just been sort of brushed away or not taken seriously by insurance companies or reimbursers. And so being forced to deal with the placebo effect and realizing that maybe psychedelics work by enhancing the placebo effect. What would it be like to keep it in and not try to get rid of it? I think those questions are really fascinating that have been on the fringes of mental health care or healthcare for a while about harnessing the placebo effect. And I'm really excited that psychedelics are pushing that forward.
You know, I think we also have an opportunity in this with mainstream medicalizing the use of psychedelics, should that come to pass. I think others sitting on either side of me would say when that comes to pass. You know, I think it does give us an opportunity to be thinking really carefully about safety. Right, so that we don't know when things are underground exactly what some of the risks are. We do know that there are risks of exploitation, there are risks of persistent changes in personality, in perceptual disturbances. So really being able to not have to be underground and being able to be mainstreamed and within the context that we know how to monitor. Right? One thing we do know from approval of new therapeutic agents is how we have to monitor and how we look for adverse effects. So I think the safety piece of it, if psychedelics prove to be as promising as they seem in changing the paradigm and the way we treat many mental illnesses, then we need to know what else we need to be doing to make sure that we're administering them and they're being used in the safest and most effective way.
Here.
Thank you. I want to pick up a little bit your point, Ernesto, about the spiritual journey. So I was born in Scotland and live in Ireland, and mushrooms were used historically. It's, you know, fairies and leprechauns were derived from people taking mushroom trips. But I'm interested in that point about mainstreaming in the context of a spiritual journey and whether or not medicalizing it is going to divorce it from its spirituality or not. So do we approach it through what's a safe dose to administer, or do we look back at ancient tradition to kind of go, well, this was how it was used? I'm just interested in that journey to kind of mainstream it in that respect and not kind of lose a spiritual dimension that, particularly in Scotland and Ireland, is in decline because the Catholic Church's reputation has, ironically, amen, gone down.
I mean, I think there's space for both lanes to exist and for cross-pollination between them. I don't think you definitely need to sort of prioritize one model versus the other. And I do think like it raises tricky questions for medicine when it comes to sort of integrating something that for many people will be a spiritual experience or will have a spiritual component. But on the other hand, if you look at addiction medicine manages to coexist with 12 steps, which is inherently a spiritual path. So, you know, in medicine, we've managed to sort of understand that many people find healing and strength and power in a spiritual practice, in God. And it won't be easy. It won't be something that I think FDA regulators will inherently sort of understand or feel very comfortable with. But it's the reality of the ecosystem as it exists. And I think there's many things that both sides can learn from one another. I think if the medical side provides very strong guardrails and, you know, efficacy and safety practices that are very rigorous, my hope would be that the underground starts modeling a lot of those, because I do think the underground is lacking in safeguards, especially for people who come into these experiences in a very vulnerable state. But on the other hand, I think among people who have, you know, degrees and PhDs and a lot of experience, there's a lot they can learn from what's happening in the underground. And I'm not sure they're paying enough attention to these spaces.
Yeah, and just to add that many people in the medical world have mystical type experiences, to the point, as Ernesto mentioned earlier, that there's a debate about whether that experience is causal in symptom reduction. But I think the cultural context is important, because just because some people have what they call mystical type experiences does not mean it's universal, and we should be open to other kinds of experiences on psychedelics. I co-run a psychedelic humanities salon series in New York, and we had an anthropologist who's studying ayahuasca use in China, which is, you know, very, very dangerous and very underground. But people in East Asia, sometimes they take ayahuasca and they don't have a mystical experience. They apply their insights to their small businesses and to their family dynamics, and it's just completely different, though equally profound and filled with insights, but very, very different. And in trials for with psilocybin and cocaine addiction in the South, people don't have this sort of perennial all is one mystical experience. They're often Christian and they see Jesus. So these experiences of big profundity can take many different forms. Another question? Maybe we'll take one in the back. Over here? Yeah.
Can you speak a little to the use of psychedelics in end-of-life care?
Yeah, I think that palliative care, psychedelics can be very, very helpful. First off, the early work with LSD that was done in the 1960s by Dr. Eric Kast was about LSD for pain control for people with severe cancer and cancer pain. So I think psychedelics in a hospice setting can be extremely helpful for enabling people to make their peace, to say goodbye to their loved ones. You get sometimes additive pain control, so you can give psychedelics to people that are on opiates for pain meds, and that they can get better pain control, and then they can be energized. The narcotics make people sleepy very much, so that they're almost not there. But then when you can add a psychedelic to it, they can get better pain control, and they could wake up and be there with their families. So I think one of the big areas, it's not going to be one of the ones that's going to be researched early, because people at the end of life are on all these other medications. And there's this whole question about drug-drug interactions. So most of what we know is from people that had life-threatening illnesses that are in studies with MDMA or psilocybin or other things, but well before they're at the end of life, well before they're in the hospice setting. And so most of the information about people in that end-of-life hospice setting comes from the underground, but it does seem to be something that can be very, very effective.
And it arguably launched the current cultural acceptance of psychedelics, because it's what Michael Pollan first wrote his New Yorker story about that turned into his book, How to Change Your Mind, which caused widespread reintroduction to psychedelics and their medical application. But there are some clinical trials ongoing right now for palliative care, which I've been really excited to see, because those early NYU Hopkins studies were quite small, but now there's a pretty big trial happening at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and I believe another one at UCLA that has hundreds of palliative care patients. And so those are ongoing. I think they're just finished recruiting.
A question I have is, pardon me, what the cost is of not bringing it into the mainstream in a fairly timely fashion. The reason I ask the question is, living in Colorado and having researched healthcare for over 10 years, I've seen so many people take their own lives and go through a lot of suffering, and of course do no harm. But in my experience, when you lose enough friends to suicide of whatever age, and we live in a suicide belt here in Aspen in the Rocky Mountain West, to me, do you ever look at the cost of not bringing this to market, essentially, and the suffering that goes on absent that?
Well, I do think very sadly about how the fact that MDMA was criminalized in 1985, and when you look at the number of veteran suicides and the number of suicides that have taken place since then that potentially could have been helped with a range of psychedelics, I think that it's really important that you point that out, that there's a cost for inaction as well, and it's very high.
I also think that one of the things we really haven't done a great job on as a psychiatrist or in the medical community itself is to really open ourselves up to existing mental health treatments, period, right? So if the best thing in the world would be that we have new transformative treatments that can help people, that can reduce the rate of suicide. That could mean that while we were all getting ready to come into this room and having this conversation, there wasn't a veteran who died by suicide, right? I think that that's the most promising thing. I also think we can't neglect the evidence that we have now and establish treatment and help people get into care, while we also maintain a sense of responsibility towards advancing that care and a sense of humility about knowing what's best for everyone in all circumstances. And I think a balance of all of this, having conversations like this, being in a place where there is a sharing of ideas and a looking from all sides, is critical to a process of figuring out how we can be a country where no one dies of suicide, right? Zero suicide would be a really great place for us to get to. No one should die from mental illness, especially not treatable mental illness.
We can take one more very quick question. Over here. Sorry, it's over here in the corner. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I feel like I hear an undercurrent through here about connection, and I'm curious, given the specialization, I feel like we're a room full of very specialized people, which I think adds to separation. What do you see for partnerships, looking back to shamans, looking at churches? How does psychiatry partner with other parts of society in this, rather than having to do it on its own?
Well, I can tell you what we're doing day in and day out with our American Psychiatric Foundation. We recognize that if we're going to be really serious about mental health, it has to be where people live their lives. So we are working in schools, we're working in religious institutions, we're working in the workplace, even through sports, to be able to really get the message out and get help and treatment and connection to people where they already feel connection and find connection. And your point is exactly critical, right? So one of the biggest problems as a psychiatrist, right, we see people when they come into our office for increasingly shorter periods of time, right? And all of life is happening outside of that consulting room. And we have to start thinking about ourselves in community and what life means in its fullest form to really be able to meet the promise of a mentally healthy country and world.
Yeah, well, one of the ways that MAPS has tried to sort of partner with where psychedelics are actually being used is in terms of what we call psychedelic harm reduction. So we've had a big project at Burning Man where many people are using psychedelics, and many of them think that, oh, they're just going to have a good time and everything's going to be fine, but a major group of people bring stuff up to the surface that they're not really capable of handling, and then they have difficult times. So we've set up programs where we have hundreds of therapists, psychiatrists, and others that are trained to do peer support when people come to us. And last year there was over 500 people at Burning Man that came for help or to talk about it, to help integrate a psychedelic experience. So we do try to take it out of the lab and the clinic and go to cultural context. And part of that is to sort of prepare the world for a post-prohibition world where there will be riskier situations, and how do we reduce the risks in those situations, and then also how do we educate people that it's not a good idea to take a psychedelic and just want to have a good time. That if you have that as an intention and something difficult comes up and then you try to suppress it, you could be worse off for months or years afterwards. So I think a lot of education has to be in terms of being open to whatever comes up, and even the difficult things. And what we like to say is that difficult is not the same as bad. Where it becomes bad is when people resist. And so how do we get that knowledge out? And so one of the ways is to do these psychedelic harm reduction programs. We do have, I'll just say, we got a training program actually for the Denver police. So it's another way out in the community. So Denver, as I said, made mushrooms the lowest enforcement priority. So now we have a training program for the Denver police and first responders what to do if they encounter somebody having a difficult trip. How do they respond? How do they react? And we've already had some good reports from people that have encountered police and first responders that have been trained and said, wow, they really handled me in a different way than I would have expected, and in a way that was very helpful rather than accelerated the problems.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for coming tonight.